Okay, you guys, let's all come back in, shall we? Continue our discussion. Man, the questions that you're asking right now, I mean, I get to say it, I did this last year, year before, a lot different questions this year in a really good way, because obviously you guys are thinking about this stuff, and you want to be able to defend it, but you also want to know it in yourself. Do you guys want to know the answers? Yeah, of course you do. Well, you know what? I had a choice. You only have limited amount of time. We're not doing a class and, all this stuff. But we are, so I'm going to pick one subject. Now, if I'm going to pick one subject, I have to look at what's happening in our world right now. What is the most relevant? Because, let's face it, like I said, in the world of science, and biology specifically, it is this world of what are we doing with what we treat people with? And you know what? It all goes back to it taking and exploiting a known system. Now, I'm going to get a little bit technical here. And when I go technical, don't go hijacking. And one of the things you really want to do, if you really want to know this, and you're not going to offend your friends, I promise. And I promise to keep your attention. I promise you. But sometimes you need to get away from your friends so that you can focus. So if everybody wants to move to a different chair so that they can listen and they're not distracted, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to do it right now. You're not going to offend your friends. Just get up and move to a chair so that you can focus. Sometimes I just need to be sitting down in a place where I can just listen, and if I don't get it, I can just go, I didn't get that, stay, because I want to get this. I need you to get this subject. So take a second and do it. Oh, okay, whatever. I can do a selfie, make a better one. No, I'm joking. Okay, go. So are we on the next slide deck is going to be on current science in the Bible. And I want to start this with our other king. We kind of look at Solomon as the good version of science. He's the one that took the wisdom and did some extraordinary things with it. Obviously, the hyssop concept. But and that's something that we'll get into later on in your life when I talk again. But this guy started off really good. This guy started off so good. He was like one of the greatest kings, even to a point where in Isaiah in chapter 6, remember when he said, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. I mean, he was just like, he had this extraordinary vision of God. But that verse in chapter 6 of Isaiah, verse 1 says, in the year that king who? Remember the king? Okay, in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1, it says, in the year that King Uzziah died. Uzziah in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 26. I need you to turn to that with me. 2 Chronicles, chapter 26, please. Here is King Uzziah. He's reigning in Judah. He becomes a king, verse 3 tells me he was 16 years old. How many of you guys are 16 in here? Okay. How many of you aren't? Okay, good. Just want to see if you're listening. Okay, good. So, he becomes king in verse 3. And you're going to notice that he reigned for 52 years. How many of you are 52? Okay, good. Awesome. Good liars. I love it. Great. And notice that in verse 4 says he did what was right in the sight of God. Epi is here. I see you. Oh my gosh. I love you, brother. I love you guys all, but okay, I'm just saying. This guy goes back. He's got some history with me. Awesome. Uzziah, okay, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And what happened? He had, on verse 5, he had understanding in the visions of God. Okay, and the Lord made him prosper. Verse 8 says, he became exceedingly strong. Verse 9 says, Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem. And then it goes on to say that he made this extraordinary army. So his goal with all of the prosperity and all the wisdom that God gave him was to fortify their army. Nothing wrong with that motive. He wanted to protect his country. A really solid moral. Just like you guys were asking me about the definitions of morality and so on. Fascinating. That's exactly what this discussion is about right now. But then you're going to notice in verse 14, Uzziah prepared for them the entire army, shields, spears, really unique forms of body armor. Do you guys realize that the body armor used in Transformers and all those kind of super action hero movies out right now, the army is starting to make these because of the different types of microbes that are being used in weapons right now. And the only way to protect you is to use these extraordinary, very sophisticated armors. So very similar, this guy realized that body armor was essential for the best. But verse 15 gives us the real key here. He made devices in Jerusalem. First time and only mentioned. Invented, devices and invented by skillful men on the towers to shoot arrows and large stones, so his fame became far and wide. Why? Because he's developed the first concept of a machine gun. This guy came up with the first M80. This guy had the idea of devising by an invention. This is the evidence of taking a need and making an invention so that you could make a more fortified and a better society, an extremely noble thing to do. This is what the drug world is trying to do as well, the one I'm in. Any world that you're in, I'm not talking the bad drugs, I'm talking the good ones, to treat anxiety, to treat, all kinds of illnesses and so on. We're working on one to treat cancer, and I'm saying this to you right now. This group that comes from Chile came up with this extraordinary little fragment of DNA, and this little fragment that when you're going to start taking it someday by just putting it right under your skin, and I'm seriously, if I could show you the pictures, I would, but you would see me get in a lot of legal issues if I showed you the data right now, because I know you guys would take the photos. Look what I got. I know you would, okay? I would, because you know what? I have seen cancer eradicated, guys. I'm not kidding you. It's going to be coming out in the next 5 years. If the funding happens on this company, these are the kind of things that you're going like, oh yeah, cancer, really? You know what though? This is the freaky part. This little piece of DNA that's just now go into your skin, it's going to go into the cancer cell because it only migrates towards cancer cells that are rapidly dividing. It goes inside and it goes into the genes that are replicating, that are making up the, it's working. And I've seen it literally eradicated. We're going to an FDA meeting in August, and I'll tell you what happens, okay? Because we're taking all the data, we're letting it sit before them, this agency, this is the group that deals specifically with this type of cancer, and they're going to review the data. They're reviewing it right this minute. And if you think I'm kidding, wait until August, and I will report back to you. You can look at our blog if you want to. Because you know what? This is what's happening, is that we're now taking these little pieces, just like what Uzziah did, and you just manipulate it, and you look at the way the systems are working, you're going like, oh my gosh, I can treat cancer. This is a good motive. We're actually shutting the genes down that are making this lymphoblastic lymphoma. It's absolutely mind-boggling. We are coming very close to this time where we're going to start seeing diseases changing, and we have no idea the ramifications of what it is. Look at what happens to man, though, when we start to have these accolades. We start saying, oh my gosh, we got rid of cancer. Because you honestly think we're going to be content with eradicating cancer? Do you really think man is going to go, okay, you can shut the buildings down, all we're going to do is make this nucleotide, we're all done with it? No more, we're done. We're good. Science is done. We finished. We took care of cancer. Let me tell you something, guys. It's never satisfied. Your nature will never be satisfied until you are completely in the presence of a living God. Because your ultimate goal on this planet is that curiosity of that knowing. Most of us want to have that certainty of satisfaction. Look at what happened to Uzziah. This guy had the most noble motives. Look at verse 16. I'm sorry. He became, verse 15 tells me he became marvelously strong. But then there's a key but word right there, isn't it? Verse 16, it's always that three-letter word that takes us out of the race. It says, but when Uzziah was strong in his heart was lifted up to the destruction of himself. For he transgressed the Lord. By what did he do? He entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar. And it goes on to tell us that the priests go in there, they try to get him out of there, and Uzziah, verse 19, becomes livid. He becomes the Bill Nyes, if you will. Sorry to say if you will again. But he becomes livid because he doesn't understand that there are things on this planet called boundaries. How far can science take me? How far does it really need to go? Is it supposed to take over my theology, my belief system? Does it answer those questions? Because Uzziah let his devices fill him so much that nothing was held back from him. Remember, Solomon turned out the same way. Remember, he had all the women in the world, and he took advantage of all of them, and his heart became hardened. Same thing that's happening with this guy is that he goes in, he pulls out the censer, puts it up on the thing, just about ready to light the flames there to do all of what the priests, because the priests, anybody could do that. They're getting all this smoke in the temple. They're getting all this reaction from God. I want that too, man. I want God to appreciate what I'm doing. Tower of Babel moment. What happens to this guy? Look what happens. When they tried to throw him out of the temple, verse 20 says, Uzziah, verse 21, became a leper, and he was smitten with leprosy, and he was cut off from all the people, and he lived the rest of his days as a leper in the middle of nowhere. And you're thinking, well, wow, that's a pretty severe consequence for arrogance. That's a pretty severe reaction that God, when it's like, why would God do this to him? He had all this stuff going for him. Okay, he blew it once, but what's up with that? This is a picture, a human picture of what happened on the Tower of Babel, with the attitude of, we shall be like God. We shall ascend to God. There's nothing that we can't do now. And this attitude is so prevalent in our society right now, particularly in the scientific arena. Because now that we're getting all this understanding, these are all now becoming utility. We're becoming machines. We can turn this into useful products. If it's in a good thing, yes, for treating cancer. If it's in a bad thing, we're going to start using it for weapons. For not only that, but limiting populations. Do you realize that China has shut down all of their genomics programs because they don't want that in the hands of scientists because they know the power of it. They have shut down all of their genomics programs right now. We have the opportunity of going to China again in September. We've been over there to teach. We have a Bible college there that was just shut down, but now it's a school of ministry. And we get to go over, and these guys that are in the scientific community there are realized that they are not allowed to work on DNA products at all anymore because the government knows its power. And in the hands of the wrong people, this is what happens. But who are the wrong people? You and I. Human nature is the wrong people. If there's not a solid motive behind it. Now, one of the most powerful of all of those motives of devices is reproduction. Because in science, it's probably the most well-characterized system of your body. Which is why there's so many challenges with abortion, with stem cell research, with anything that is going to be involved with what we don't see, and that's called the womb. And for you ladies in here, and for you guys in here, we have to remember something, that the womb is designed for both man and woman, i.e., guys just don't have fun with a girl and leave, and there's no problems, and they can just split. They're just as involved. So the abortion debate isn't just for women to deal with. This whole idea about birth and how life begins and where does conception and all that stuff is still the big mystery of Planned Parenthood. Don't worry, we'll take care of it for you. My passion for you this morning is that you would not leave here without realizing when life begins. You want to know that? You want to know when life begins inside of the womb? Raise your hands if you do. I'm just curious. How many of you guys know when it begins? You say at conception, what does that even mean? So let's look at the first slide. And I've got something in here that is important because I had to pick one general subject. We talked about regenerative medicine. We'll talk about that. Synthetic biology and genomics. They all are wrapped into this subject. Regenerative medicine is simply that. It is taking your tissue or tissue from another being, placing it into your body, and it causing a new tissue to form. Now that sounds very good and wonderful, doesn't it? It sounds like it would be a great way to solve a problem like a bad liver, a bad kidney, bad lungs, bad anything. Let's just regenerate the tissue. And that from in itself, by definition, the Institute for Regenerative Research there in San Diego, and you've got a couple of them throughout the United States, is all great. But people say, oh, yeah, but what about embryonic stem cells? What about messing with embryos? That's a problem, isn't it? Why is that a problem? Because you're destroying life. Well, how do we know when life begins? And then we get into this discussion. Then we get a proposition in the politics and so on. And as Christians, we get tongue-tied because we don't know when life begins. So we go, well, okay, you can just use, we don't know when to make that decision. It's very important that we know that answer. That's why in synthetic biology, synthetic genomics, these kind of ideas, if I don't know when life begins, then I can start messing with it at any time because it's just tissue. And because it's just tissue, I can do whatever I want with it. Because if I take it out of your body, I can start to change it, and I can manipulate it, and I can make cells out of it so that I can use it for other things. So it becomes more of a utility than what it actually is a living system. So this whole area, when you see that word genomics, just think of DNA and how you can manipulate DNA so that you can either make good products or you can start manipulating it wrongly, and you can be using it for things like we were talking about earlier, changing the way the face looks and so on. These things that are all about this aesthetic beauty that we're all wanting and long life that we're wanting, because the motivation is that we'll never die. We're all going to die. So if we're all interested in trying to prolong our life as long as possible, well, let's face it, why don't you just eat right and exercise? That's probably the best solution. But no. Give me the pill, give me the injection, and we'll just make it a lot easier, and I can stick with the desserts. And that's the sad part is that we want the easy way out. We don't want to have to do the discipline. Just give me Jurassic Park. Remember that table scene? We're sitting around the table? He goes, wow, I can't believe the lack of humility. Remember that little line that he threw out there? And they're all looking at him like, well, you know, that however wacko that little line was, if you haven't seen that movie lately, the acting stinks, but the words are profound. Because you remember that he actually said that because these guys were saying, well, we'll have a coupon day or something. But you know what? Those stupid lines that are in that movie are very profound today. Because we're starting to take the science we know and we're going to turn it into this Disneyland of genomics, and that's exactly what's happening. Now, the next slide, I want you to look at, this is where we're going with this. Okay, I know what you're thinking right now. You're going like, I can't even read that. Is this an eye chart? What are the little balls for? I mean, am I supposed to like a video game? You know, this whole thing is a video game right now. Because really what this is showing you is this. Is that at the very top there, you're going to see a thing called a zygote. And we all took this in sex education, and I'm not here to do that right now, although it is important for you and I to know something a little bit more important as far as taking our science down to more of what we do know. Because you're going to notice that when that zygote actually forms with that sperm entering that egg, we start to get this development of this fetus that becomes a human. But you're going to notice that word up there called a blastocyst, if you can read it. And that's what's used for making what are called embryonic stem cells. That's when they take an embryo, they bust it up into pieces, and they take that little group of cells, they pull those out because those are the holy grail of a living system of a body. Because those cells, there are about 200 of them, if I put them into a little dish here, they are totipotent. They can become anything I want them to become. They are a little factory at my disposal. And I can literally add chemicals to certain cells of that little group, and they'll become liver cells, they'll become kidney cells, they'll become anything I want. Don't you love it when that happens? And that, if this is truly what my motive is, I'm going to do this for your benefit right now. I'm going to make those cells into whatever they want to become. And that's what this is all about, is that I don't know about you, but I think that's a really cool motive. Now, you're going to see on the next slide that this whole little piece that you see here of all the different cells that we can ultimately get in the world of science and how we can actually make a new system is this. Is that if you can't see that, but this is kind of reiterating what I just said, is that you can take these cells and that little golden little mass in the middle there, that number 3, you can see that those are the cells we take out, we put them into a dish, and lo and behold, we grow them in this dish, and they become what they're supposed to be. This is how stem cells work. This is how I make regenerated medicine. I take them out of this embryo, and they become what I want them to become, just as you're seeing right here. Next slide shows you this. A human embryo has 200 different types of tissues. I don't know about you, but that would be really cool, because if you had a bad kidney, if you had a bad lung, if you had anything like that, you go to the doctor, they look and they go, you know what, Louis, we're going to have to do something about your kidney. And, your brothers and sisters can't donate to you, but we'll regenerate one for you. We're going to take some of the stem cells from this tissue, we're going to knock it out with a certain type of cell, and we're going to make it into this tissue so that you will have a brand new kidney. How many of you guys would like that? I'm just curious. If you had a bad kidney, or would you like to just go and get a transplant from somebody else? Raise your hands if you want a transplant. Okay, from somebody else? Okay. Or you don't want to have one made for you? I mean, that sounds kind of cool. If they're able to make it for you. Wow, okay. So if you didn't want it made, then look at the next slide. You're going to see that there's some things that I need you to know. These are all in the area of theology. And oh, sweet. Thank you so much, Aaron. Is this. Okay. You're asking me about ethics. I'm going to give you some words in ethics that we need to know about in this world we're living in science that we're living in. First and foremost is this word, hylomorphism. That means this. Everything on this planet, life, is a matter and form. Everything. So if I accept that concept that all it is skin, flesh, bone, that's all we are, that's a hylomorphic principle. So that if all you think you are today is just this being sitting in this chair that's just flesh and blood, all I know is what I can see and what I exist of, and fair enough, I got DNA, but this is it, all I am, then you have an agreement to just the hylomorphic principle. But there's a problem with this principle because we have this one that Aristotle came up with called ensoulment. In other words, if you were just matter and form, I'd have no problem with that, with the stem cell concept or any kind of concepts of abortion or anything that happens with living systems. But there's something that happens at conception. The minute in which a human being gains a soul. When did your soul come into your body? Do you guys realize that at a place called the theology place up in LA, I can't remember, it's just like gone. Oh, you know it. Fuller Seminary. We were just at a discussion up there. They say that the soul is an emergent property. What does that mean? That as your embryo develops, so does your soul, and so it just develops over time, and your soul isn't fully present until you're fully conscious. So what would that actually mean? That would mean that you're not fully human until you're born or then until you're at a certain age, so that there are tissues in your body and your embryo even is just a mass that can be manipulated. Do we all agree with that? No, of course not. But if you do believe in that, this concept of ensoulment becomes a big issue. That's why when we talk about these emergent properties, this whole thing of your existence, living systems, your body is built on systems from cells that come from that original embryo. Now, why am I telling you this? Because I'm trying to confuse you. And I'm also trying to tell you that there is a way in which, if you take the way God designed you and the way you exist right now, there had to be something that connected a soul into your body. In other words, how did a soul get into my system? When did I become this thing that I'm living in right now? When was I made uniquely in my body? Well, you'll notice that the next slide tells me some of this. Is that in the Bible, in Exodus 21:22, it says, if one strikes a woman with child and she miscarries, indeed, if her death ensues upon, he shall render life for life. In other words, if this child is killed when this woman is struck, that means that the life is going to be required from the person who hurt her, because you're actually killing two lives, if you will. There is another life inside of her. So here's evidence in the Bible that there's a living system inside of a woman, regardless of what a society tells you, that this system is a living entity. But when is always the question. Because even in this verse, you look at it and you go, yes, we get that. It's when we can recognize that it's a human form, then we get it. Now, some of us have no problems with this, but we've never answered that question in our souls. And there may be some women and some guys in here that are questioning if this is a plausible thing. Because, guys, there is a huge effort from, Planned Parenthood specifically, from different words that they use for this kind of organization to make this concept of abortion much more appealing and much more feasible. Especially if you're going to get down to the very roots of it, because then if I can dehumanize, if I can materialize, if I can hylomorphize, then I can really get it so that this agenda can be so that it becomes a very normal, natural thing that happens. Now, you're going to notice that this next idea then goes on to say this. Thomas Aquinas, back then a theologian from decades ago, years, centuries. But he did make a point about this. He said, if he'd known the facts about embryology, i.e., he would have held to this idea that the human soul is present from fertilization. This idea of sperm entering the egg. And this is where regenerative medicine, this is where all of what's happening in synthetic biology, all of it comes into existence when I understand what's happening when I get the formation of an individual human being or an individual entity. When does it happen? Because if I can make a gray area on this area of life, then it gives you all kinds of excuses. Ethically, morally, physically, excuses for minimizing what's going on in here. And let me tell you something. The enemy of your soul is a roaring lion. He's seeking whom he may devour. And trust me, this is the one area he loves to keep in the gray zone. Because he knows that if we can get into this little section of biology and make it as gray as possible, then there's no problem with Christians and non-Christians agreeing with this in society. Now, let's think about this for a second. Here's what this actually looks like. Well, let's look at some of this idea about when the life actually begins. Let's look at the next slide. Okay. I don't want you to, that's just the idea. This is what's called procured abortion. This is what, from the time that an ovum, a cell of a woman, is fertilized, a new life is begun, which is neither that of the father or of the mother. It's rather a life of a human being with his own growth. When does this happen, though? When is this idea? These are all documents that come out of abortion clinics that are trying to tell you that this is the I hate to say the nonsense, but this is really what this idea of an allowance for a change of thinking as far as when life begins. Next. This is what it actually looks like. The moment that a zygote, that's what the cell is that's formed here, with the sperm and the egg, is formed, demands unconditional respect, and it is morally due to a human being, and is bodily, spiritually as well. Because you're going to notice this twinning. Two twins are forming right now, and this is in a separate entity. This is the zygote. This is the two new cells that are forming, the two beings that are forming even inside of the cell. Next slide. This is what happens. This is what this metaphysical principle shows us as far as fertilization is concerned. When you have the largest egg or the largest cell of a human body is the ovum from a woman. That's the largest cell of your body. The smallest cell of the human body is the sperm cell. The slowest moving is the ovum. The fastest moving is the sperm cell, obviously. And the way these two work together is how you define how life begins. Because let's face it, we just say, well, when the sperm goes in the egg, we all learn this whole concept, but we miss the whole idea about the way life actually starts and when it actually begins. Because you're going to notice that this guy right here he is. He's made a long journey. He's the only one, apparently, that can come up. But you can see something's happening right here. And this big old thing that's right here, something is going on that is extremely important as far as how life is actually generated. Because you notice, remember, there's 23 chromosomes in here, 23 in here, and they get together and they form 46. That's kind of like the general dogma about how a being comes into existence. But the next slide shows me something. Is that there's something that happens on this egg. And you're going to notice that this little line here, this is on a human ovum. And this line that's in here is loaded with certain types of molecules that are waiting for a certain type of a molecule that comes from a sperm. Now, this always trips me out, how we're fearfully and wonderfully made. And if you think about this, as far as how this actually works, now that the biotechnology world has gotten really involved in this, because we want to know exactly how this is done, so that we know exactly when and how to, yes, define life, but how to regenerate this process. We're now going to take a little journey down. You can't see this very well, but that little red here and this little green here are showing me that something's in this little zone. That's what it's called. The zone of light is what this is actually called. This is the zone of light here. What happens? Go to the next slide. Look at this. It's showing me this. Okay, well, this is just a moral statement here, but we have to remember that that little zone of life comes by the fact that it's either messing with that zone of light so that I can make more life for my own purposes, or I can have what's called, okay, just make sure this thing called Immanuel Kant, which you're going to see in your future in philosophy classes, where you're going to have this relativism saying, don't worry, it's just biology, it's just the hylomorphic concept, we can mess with this all we want to. Remember something, that the more you learn on this, the more your tendency is to be creative, to do something with it, just like King Uzziah. So if you're listening to this with a pure heart this morning, let me encourage you to be creative. But for what ends is for the betterment of mankind, yes. Not for the utilitarianism or the hylomorphic concept that this is just tissue. This tissue is doing something very, very, very profound. Next slide shows me that in a cartoon format. Look at this. This little zona here, this yellow zone of light, you're going to notice that this sperm here is trying to get in there, so is this guy. These guys have all got this little tip here that have an understanding about where to go. Now, we've all seen the videos. We've all seen how difficult the journey is for the sperm cell. And yes, you and I are not a mistake. You're one in close to 1.5 million people that made it up this canal of acid that arrived, and you won the lottery. You are a lottery winner if you exist, because you're actually the one that got through the zona pellucida. You did it. Congratulations. Because all of us arrived. And we all did. You should give your hands a round of applause. You did it. Yes, we did it. Now, how do we get through this? Well, there's something that attracted you up here. And you fought a lot of people to get there. And once you saw that yellow thing existed, I don't know if you remember this happening. Do you remember? You were really racing up there. Well, look what happened on the next slide. You'll see what happened. Is that this thing happened. Now, look. I know this is super complicated, but I want you to notice it. Here he is. He has this little black thing right here. And he found this little region here that he sticks to. But once he binds to it, this little piece here, like a fingernail, busts off. And it allows him to go into this big zone of light. And once it gets into this zone of light, seriously, why would they call it that? Because this is what's happening. The concept of ensoulment is happening. That's why it's so profound. Because check this out. This is what just trips me out, man, as a biologist. Is that you come into this zone of light, and with him, he comes in. Here he is. He comes in here, and he comes into this new zone. The minute he comes into this new zone, his tail starts to disappear, and he now gets incorporated into it. And in this fascinating phase here is when the soul joins with him in this new life formation. Because ensoulment would happen right along the zone of pellucida, and coming into here, he now is going to loose all of his DNA. It fuses with the DNA that already exists in here, and he has the potential of a new life, because that life has the soul grabbed with it. Now biologically, how can we say that happened? This process is so not only well-defined, the next slide shows me that we have this electron micrograph that actually shows us when and how this actually happens. And not only from microtome videography, you can actually see this. And if I had the video and the time, guys, right now, I would show you every microsecond. But you can go to the YouTube. You can watch zona pellucida penetration by sperm. You can actually watch the way the fingernail tips off, and you can see it come in, and it's the evidence of this new situation. And what happens right when it gets in is that you get this change of molecules. The minute it gets inside, this chain reaction all along the pellucida changes its format completely from this yellow light into an opaque gate. Nothing else can enter. It becomes this literally gateway. It's as strong a gateway, theologically, as the angel going like this in the garden. You ain't coming back in here anymore. And that's why two sperms getting in is not only miraculous, it's impossible to have a different form of life. Two can get in at the exact same instant, and that can happen, but it's extremely rare. The purpose being that the seal off of that is the entity. People say, when does personhood, when does life begin? That's when life begins. That's when a human life is defined. And that instant that fingernail came off, it got in, lost the tail, and that little passageway going into the zone of light, nobody else is in there. That is a new entity, and that is soul. Now, it's different than spirit, obviously. Next slide. This is where it's happening all along in here. Next slide. you're going to see during fertilization, this little fingertip here is the most profound part of the human system, because when it gets released, this contents in here goes inside of this zone and forms an existing entity, nothing else. Raise your hands if you understand what I've just talked about. Awesome. Do you guys know how complicated this is to teach in biology classes? You know why? Because people are so hijacked. You're not. You know why? Because you're looking at this with an end. And you know what? I want you to look at this as not information. Think about it for a second. And I'm not saying this in a bad way. I'm saying this in a very good way. How could you manipulate this for the betterment of mankind? How could this be looked at for a way of designing something like this so that it could help in a medicine? Because if I look at this as a scientist, or as anybody, just like you and I all are scientists, outside the box is all it is. It has nothing to do with being smart. It has to do with being creative. Oh my gosh, what do you mean? I've always seen biology as a creative. What would happen if? What would happen? That's interesting. It's letting yourself be willing to be creative, because you are. You were designed to be a creator. You know, God calls you a poema in Ephesians chapter 2. You're his workmanship, created for good works in Christ. Yes, sharing the gospel. Yes, but you know what? He designed you to be creative, to do something with your brain. Because guess what? As you saw that and you get this right now, one of the best things you can do in the next 10 minutes is to talk to somebody about it and think about it for a second. Because I guarantee you questions will come up in your mind, i.e., questions like, why then is abortion allowed? Oh, something like that. An ethical question. Why not a biological question? How could this be used for making a better system for people that can't get pregnant? How can this be changed so that we can make it so that you can make it so that people have always had a difficult time with this? Because some guys have a really bad fingernail. Is there a way of making that something that could be more useful so that they are able to do that, so that it is able to work? Stuff like that is what science can be about for the positive. See, Uzziah took it too far. He entered into outside the boundaries. It was hurting him because he was not called to be a priest. And he transgressed God's law completely. Transgressing God's law in something like this is saying, you know what? This is just tissue. This is just can be manipulated, and we can utilize all these cells so that we can make them for our benefit. And it's the whole stem cell issue that is the problem. There's a lot more to this than just the harm of mankind. The next slide. Okay? So that's why when I talked about synthetic biology, it's just as a conclusion, I want you to think about this also. It's that all of what I just showed you, if you were to design and construct new biological parts, let's say the fingernail that you saw on there, for example, and a device and a system to redesign existing natural system, that is a really cool concept from my perspective, from your perspective. But you look at like, oh, no science, careful. Because God's designed you, it's like walking up to an artist and saying, oh, paints, acrylics, watercolor. You have to remember something, is that it's who's painting the picture. Who's behind that microscope? Who actually pulled out the telescope and looking at it? Because you know what, guys? It goes back to Psalm 19. Search me. Know my heart. If there's anything wicked in me, Lord, free me from those presumptuous sins. Then the science makes sense. Then my questioning becomes a real reality because you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God wants you to use you for the glory of God. I would pray that all of you guys would work in the science industry. Why? Because the glory of the Lord would shine out of you in ways that you would never know I mean, you can be anything on this planet. You guys are all making choices in your decisions in life. And some of us look at this and go, yeah, but you're making this. This is not, it's only evil based on your heart. Now, if you go into these science places that are doing the wrong thing, you don't go into that industry. You look at what they're doing. Do I want to follow people that have an evil heart in this? Or do I want to be a leader with a good heart? Now, what I'd like to do, just on what I just talked about, that paradigm, anything on that or any science, I'm going to take a few minutes, and I want you to ask any questions right now. Just go for it. I don't care what the question is, but just don't ask me about my Social Security number or anything. Yeah?
Could you add more soul to the sperm?
Okay, let's see. That's an excellent question. Okay. Can you add more soul to the sperm? Is it a quantitative process? Remember, ensoulment is not done by, sorry. It's not really funny. Anyway. Ensoulment isn't something I can quantify because if the soul could be measured, trust me, that in the wrong hands would be real nasty. Ensoulment is a process that occurs during the passage of the sperm through the zona pellucida, because that's when a new entity is formed, and that's when the zygote is locked shut. There's no other time it could get in there, physically. So if we're going to make a physical process of time in which that would occur, that would be the time it occurs. Okay? Yeah.
Because I'm pretty sure that science, like those scientists that do abortions, or I mean, I'm just saying those doctors that do that stuff, know well about, how this works. So then, why would then they do it then, knowing how amazing this is?
And it is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the most important part of your question.
Yeah.
Because it is amazing. But number two, we always have to go back to, just like we said in Psalm 19, right? Is that science is amazing, like you said. In the right hands, it could be extraordinary. In the wrong hands, it can create some of the most horrific events that we still aren't aware of, even on this planet right now. So it depends on whose hands it's in. So it's all really based on the moral nature. That's why those principles from the very beginning, the hylomorphism word. Are we just matter and form, or is there something more to us than that? Is it just utilitarian? In other words, we're just using our body parts as just things that we can manipulate to make ourselves better, or is there something more to us than that? See, this whole concept of how we understand that is why Uzziah is the best example, because all of what he had was for the greater good. The challenge of him is that he took it too far. His pride and his arrogance thought he could do anything. So he went into the temple and started doing stuff that he knew was wrong because of his arrogance. Okay? Yeah.
That area that you said closes off as a barrier and doesn't let any of those in, is that able to, can they themselves manipulate it so that they can reopen it and allow more to come in?
Okay, that's an excellent question. In other words, how do we make certain that that is completely sealed shut so that there's nothing that can occur? Well, the only thing that will ever occur to that is when that zygote travels down the fallopian tubes and goes into the uterus and it starts to hang out there, it stays in there. And there are specific cells that recognize, so yes is your answer, because there are certain cells that recognize that new entity that has now come and is stuck up against the uterus. And the first thing that happens is it goes into this waterbed and goes, oh my gosh, this is so comfortable. And it's lying there. Then all of a sudden, these things literally, a molecule called, you want to know what it's called? VEGF, vascular endothelial cell growth factor, comes on those cells and literally penetrates this, we're talking solid crystal. And once it penetrates it, it starts the process of making a blood vessel bore its way into that, and all of a sudden we start to get the origin of a cord of blood. Umbilical cord starts to form, and that's where that attachment occurs. Implantation science, dude, is the greatest of all. It's fascinating. Talk about an area of understanding biology. How does that work? And anyway, I trust me, I can really go off on that. So yes, I agree. That's a really good question. Yes.
My question, not really scientific, more history. When did, abortion start, and was it as accepted as it is, today?
Wow. Oh my gosh. When did abortion start? What's the origin of abortion, i.e.? There's biblical examples that would imply that. When did it become such a huge issue? Abortion has been going on for millennia. They're induced. They could be something that is not induced, i.e., women could have a miscarriage. They could happen at different times. However, to have the industry going like we understand it now has been in the last 30 to 40 years in which we've seen an unprecedented number of abortions that it's just an accepted process. And it's become a form of birth control. We have no idea how devastating it is until you actually start looking at the statistics that's involved. And they have to make an excuse for all this. See, it's not so much, yes, it is a horrific situation. However, the real devastation is the one that's having it. Because the trauma that this woman is having by having this life taken from her, it's beyond a spiritual concept. Because there's a concept of attachment. Her body has attached to another being. Guys will never understand this. But we do see the effects of it in women that have this, the guilt factor can be really devastating. So this has been going on and I'm saying millennia, for a long time. It hasn't become an industry until the last, several decades.
How rare are twins?
Oh, that's a great question, too. How rare are twins? What's the frequency of twinning? Well, my wife, standing in the back there, is an replica twin. Her identical twin passed away a few years ago. But, replicated twins, I would love to give you probabilities. Trust me. Because it comes so late in the actual formation of the final zygote, it's difficult to make that probability. I can't say 1 out of every, 300, fertilizations you're going to have twinning. It is definitely a probability that is based on the pedigree and within the family tree itself. So there is probabilities within the family, but as far as an overall population probability, it's really difficult to make that assessment. Yeah. Yes. I'm so glad you asked me that question. Okay, because it's going to, the name of the blog is under creation, but it's called Creation by Design, and more details are to follow on this subject, okay? So, yeah.
If someone were to come to you who knew someone who had an abortion, or someone had an abortion and came to you for comfort, what would you say?
Oh man, that's obviously the person who has a heart to want to come for help is the first step. Because there's an acknowledgement, just like all of us, it'd be one thing to say that this situation, yes, is deplorable. Yes, it's very difficult. Yes, the guilt is there. And instead of exploiting how bad the person was for that, it's learning how God has forgiven this person. And learning how to move on, understanding that there is a God who loves this person, this woman, who so much that he's not only forgiven her, but she needs to know that she can continue on in her life, realizing that God is in complete control and he's all sovereign. So understanding God's attributes are extremely important. Yeah. Yeah.
What causes tubal pregnancy?
Well, okay, excellent. What causes it? Well, it'd be really nice to have a great mechanism for that process. However, tubal pregnancy, remember, we have, well, not remember, but so we have the way the whole ovary system happens. The ovaries are out here, like out in space. Then you have, within the uterus, you have the fimbria that sort of are loosely attached to the ovary. And so that the ovum is going to come through the space and it will ultimately enter into the fallopian tubes. And once it travels down these fallopian tubes, there are cilia, just like in your lungs, that move this ovum along passively. But it is a process in which this ovum will travel down the fallopian tubes and ultimately end in the uterus. Okay? It's kind of scary for a guy to be talking about this, but here I am. I'm a biologist, so I can do anything I want. And as this process is happening, there are times, and I'm not going to say how it always happens, but there are times when the cilia dysfunction or the movement of the ovum could stop the process just because of some mechanistic property that is, I hate to say is improbable, but it could be arrested there, and then it will try to form some level of implantation, but it can't implant there, so it will begin to start growing because it could be vascular endothelial growth factor could be secreted there, and you could actually try to get some sort of blood vessels that would come into it, and you could actually get the formation of now this embryo is going to start growing, and you will start to go through 1 or 2 trimesters, and it will cause the fallopian tube to burst, and it could be lethal in that process. Yeah.
Over here. Hello. Okay. So, with, I don't know if I remember the exact terms, but with like synthetic biology, and then when you can like reproduce, like make new organs and that kind of thing, and then with like the injections with the cancer, and it goes and kills all the cancer.
Yeah.
How does the Christian go about dealing with these things? Like, for instance, like with me, I'm a type 1 diabetic.
Right.
And so synthetic biology could one day help me not have
Exactly.
diabetes, right? So is that something that I can pursue and still represent God?
Absolutely. The goal is, remember, it's the goal. That, just like I said, everybody can have a pipette in their hand, but it's the heart that's holding it. So if I know that this is simply a utilitarian issue, in other words, let's say we're going to do synthetic biology. Let's say we're going to do some new islet cells for your pancreas. Okay, so that's what the cells are that secrete the insulin that are inside it. Okay, what a great motive. Let's see where we can get some islet cells. Well, we got to get a pancreas. Let's go get a pancreas. Okay, where are we going to get that? Well, we're going to have to go and get it from a synthetic biology lab. Where are they getting the tissue? Well, we're going to go and get it from, where? Where are we going to get that from? Well, we're going to get it from cells where are we going to get the cells from? The cells are going to come from, are they coming from embryos? Where are they coming from? So we have to look at the origin of the tissue. Because remember, this is where biology always has to work. You have to go to the mechanism to define the ethics. Do you understand that idea? Look at the way it works, the mechanism of am I getting this and its origin, and then I'll make the decision if it's an ethical process. This is a world, there's a field, we used to teach the class here at the Bible College called bioethics. Understanding ethical principles from a biological principle. It's extremely important for Christians to know that, right? So, yes, I would say that would be an excellent thing to look at, but look at the origin of the tissue, okay? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's, yeah. Gosh, okay, these are excellent questions. In other words, if we're designed perfectly, who are we to mess with God's DNA? Because He designed it. Okay, just like in biology and theology, you always have to go back to your mechanism. Understanding that extremely important question is going back to the origin of man's condition. Because we have to know that we are designed extremely. We were designed to never die. Adam and Eve were designed to never die. That's freaky. Why did they die? Exactly. So the sin nature dictates, sadly, man's heart. And so even if we have good ideas or good morals, with the outcome is going to have a sin nature to it. So for me to have no problem messing with the DNA or the genes, I would think, and sadly, this is what I even thought in my past, is that if I could just manipulate the sickle cell anemia gene, let's think about it. Sickle cell anemia, it's one DNA piece of the 1.5 billion. There's only one. If we could just move one, we could eradicate that gene. The problem with that one is that, it's like I said earlier, it affects the others. So I can't go in and start messing with one because I know it will affect others, A, and because my sin, sad nature, is that the minute I start messing with it, it's not going to stop me from messing with others because I don't have limits. The sin nature knows no limits. Okay? A great book on that note is The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. Anybody ever read that? It's a great book. It's a really thin one, great one about utilitarianism concepts. The abolition of man. Yeah. Yeah.
What if there's a pregnancy that is like an ectopic pregnancy that's like dangerous to the health of the lady?
Okay, and see, that in that case, this is always the ethical issue. Who goes, right? Because if the baby comes to full term ectopically, which means that it's not going to be in any sort of cavity for it to survive life, it will die. If it continues to even be in this area, it's going to affect the vital organs of the mom, and she will die. So there has to be a decision based on the mom, who's going to go, both of us or one of us? So she has to make that decision, and that's when something like an induced either abortion or an extraction has to be taken care of. It's the same thing that has to happen in those kind of ethical dilemmas, and it has to be up to the individual to do so. Because there's no other way around it. Good question, though, yeah. Yeah, the back one first, and then the front one. Yes? Okay, play telephone and then pass it up so somebody can say it to me. I didn't hear.
Well, you said earlier how it's rare that two sperms would hit an egg.
But hit an egg, yeah.
What would happen if that happened?
Well, then you get two different individuals. You get what's called paternal twins. So you can actually have the egg that would make that allowance for two. But like I say, it's extremely rare when that would happen. You can also have it when you can have the division that happens even inside of the cell, just like I showed you the twinning as well. That could happen like Miss Suleiman, remember her, who had 15 kids, right? I mean, it was just an insane number, so those are not very normal, right? That can happen with other species, but not necessarily, not with humans.
What is this idea that they're trying to push that there's a gay gene?
Okay. And that's such an idea, and it's such a motive, because again, it goes back to mechanism. And it goes back to what we understand about biology. Because just like having the genes for alcoholism, same thing. It's the gene for, any sort of behavior. Because you have to go back to the definition of gay gene and gay. The idea is that if in fact it is a behavior that has a genetic origin, then you can eradicate the gene, thereby eradicate the behavior. Or if you want the behavior, you can get the gene for it. But see, behavioral genetics are multifactorial genes. In other words, there isn't one specific gene that has ever been identified. UCSF has worked on this. University of California in San Francisco, you can look at the literature. It's been going on for the last 30 years of trying to identify even what's called an alternate type of gene that would give even behaviors related to homosexuality. And the reality of that is there's been no definitive evidence for it whatsoever genetically, And no genetics related to it. It's based on a behavior that originates from a variety of circumstances. And so when someone uses the term, I'm born that way, early phases could happen behaviorally that causes choices to be made and so on. So it becomes more of a moral than a biological effect. Yeah. How do you define morality? Oh, gosh, that's a great one, because you could either call it, like we said earlier, absolutism or relativism. There's two big areas, aren't they? Absolutism is this, a great example. This is dogma. This is like absolutely right. The Word of God is perfect. It even said that in Psalm 19, right? So the moral code of this book is absolute right. Now, if I say, you know what, I don't believe that. There's a lot in here that I don't believe. I don't believe Sodom and Gomorrah, Noah's Ark. Are you kidding me? Swallowed by a whale? I mean, we go back and forth, like, seriously? Everybody in this book is evil. I mean, come on, how can you say this is absolutely perfect? But here's the key, is that for me to be going like this, putting it down like this, playing tennis like this, means that it's relative to me. So when it's subjective, it becomes relative. When it's objective, it's perfect. That's how I define a moral code. Yeah.
Is the embryonic cell the only place that we can get the tissue from?
That's an excellent question. Oh my gosh. Okay, thank you for saying that. Did somebody tell you to say that? Okay, good. Are you guys okay with these questions? Okay, all right, because these are extreme ethics in our society right now. That question's huge. Can I get the embryonic-like stem cells somewhere else? You know what's really freaky? Okay, there's something that you can actually do to a cell in your body, like a fat cell, any cell, and you can put in, okay, I'm just saying, you can put in a gene into the cell and cause it to become a stem cell-like cell. It's called induced pluripotency, where you can actually put a chemical or a gene into the cell and cause it to become that. But you know what's even more freaky? Oh, this is so trippy. And you can get the paper. It's online. It's free if you're really interested. Oh, my gosh. My mind is tripping out with this so much these days. Okay, I talked about leprosy, remember? Remember how he died? Check this out. This is freaky. Are you listening to me? Raise your hands if you are, because everything's enthusiasm to me, but this is really enthusiasm. Okay, listen to this. Leprosy, the bacteria that causes leprosy, when it goes into a person, it goes into your lungs, and this bacteria takes a taxi, literally, out to the neurons that are on the outsides of my body. That's why people, when you see leprosy, their parts of their body drops off because the nerves stop functioning. But here's something really trippy, is when this bacteria takes the taxi down there, it doesn't just go and mess with the nerves. How does it do that? It goes inside of the nerve cell, and it secretes a chemical that causes the cell, check this out, to become stem cell-like cells. They literally devolve into stem cells. And these stem cells migrate to muscle tissue, and they're leprosy muscle cells that grow into muscle tissue, causing you to have leprous muscle tissue, which is why people can't move their arms. You become completely disfigured because the leprosy has changed your cells into stem cell-like cells, causing your body. That's freaky. Okay? Go to your internets. You can even do it now. Type in leprosy and stem cells. I dare you to do that. You can email me with your thoughts. It's louwing@calvarychapel.com if you have any questions about it. And if you write something really weird, it's just going to be spam anyway. But no, here's this. If you have any questions about that, seriously, contact me about that. Leprosy and stem cells. I'd encourage you to do that. And write Lou, L-U, Wing, @calvarychapel.com. I'd be happy to answer your question. Yeah. Yes.
So if
ensoulment happens at conception, right? When
Yes.
the sperm and the egg,
Yeah.
there they become.
Yeah.
What happens to all of the experimental embryos then? To the souls?
Isn't that the freakiest question? No, seriously. I mean, I'm sitting in your chair looking at me the same way. I'm going like, really? I agree. That's more of a statement. That's not a question. It really is. How about the number of aborted fetuses? I mean, for that matter, what's happening with that? Guy, dude, why do you think we would want to make this, I mean, obviously, one of the challenges as being a Christian is not getting political, but you know what? We're in the world, but we're not of the world. And there are times and places in our lives where we're going to be sitting there, and you're going to ask that question. And I'd encourage you to ask the question. Because it's a statement, is what you just said, okay? And sorry, I wish I had a better answer, but that's extremely important. Oh, yes, the beautiful woman in the back.
Hi, hello, is this working? I'm his wife. I just want to help you clarify that.
Okay.
The thing that happens to that baby, to that soul, is that soul goes straight to heaven.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry.
No
yes,
questions asked. Just like David's baby that died before any abortion, any embryo that's taken out for any wrong reason, that soul that God created goes straight to heaven. What Satan meant for evil, God will work for good, and all those souls are in heaven. They didn't have to go through what we're going through here. So they got saved, right? They went straight home. So that's the answer. If you were in a discussion with somebody and you ask them that, you're basically making a statement. What do you think? You're asking them to think. Think about what this is about. That baby just went, let me help you, that baby just went to heaven. The woman who had the abortion, that's the comfort you give her. That baby is in heaven. All right? So sorry, I was ready to explode. I needed to answer that.
No, this is a very hot topic, and we're involved with a lot of these kind of life choices, for example, most excellent way and everything. Yeah.
So you were talking about leprosy and how it turns them back into stem cells, and do you think in the future maybe you'd be able to use something like leprosy to make stem cells and use those?
Okay. What's your name again?
Abel.
Abel. That's perfect. Okay. This because you're able to do this. You, ask the lucky question, man. That's the question I wanted asked. Because that's what causes a creative mind, is to say, how could this be used for the benefit? Absolutely. I'm asking the same question. Because that, to me, is using something that could be harmful as to how could this benefit us? What are we learning from this disease? Instead of feeling like victims, how could it be something that could be a benefit? Absolutely. You need to read that paper. I'd encourage you to get it. It's free on the internet.
What can I expect people who are, pro-abortion or pro-getting stem cells from fetuses, what can I expect them to tell me for their point, like what they believe is right?
Like, why would it be of value to use an embryonic stem cell? Well, just like we said earlier, they're going to always cloak it. They're going to always cloak it in, remember that word, utilitarian? Remember that's using it as you saw it as matter and form, the hylomorphic, those big words. They're looking at it solely as a biological tissue. They see no spiritual conflict whatsoever. You have a conflict with that. They don't. So they're going to come on the preposition that you don't either. That's why we have to make it very clear that this is not just a biological principle, there's a spiritual condition going on here. And this is why we make a statement about it. Because I should expect them to come to me cloaked in that concept of utilitarianism. where it's only tissue in both cases.
So the Bible says that we're fearfully and wonderfully made.
Yeah.
The Bible says there's verses that says that God's made each of us with a plan for our lives, with work to do. What do you say to the person who was born under less than ideal circumstances, i.e., rape, et cetera, but they're born? Do those verses apply? Why? Talk to us about the heart of God in those situations.
Absolutely. And my wife nailed it a second ago, so I appreciate you saying that as well, to reinforce the fact that, yes, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. And not only does it go on in that psalm, but it concludes with, to search me and know my heart, try me and know my ways, see if there's anything wicked in me, because all have sinned, whatever your life circumstances have become. And that's the key, is understanding that even in the discussions that we've had, however God designed us, all of us are responsible to God. And all of us are designed for a purpose for why we exist, wherever our origins come from on this planet. God's heart is that we would have fellowship with him and glorify him in everything that we're doing. And guys, I know that after the discussions we've talked about today, with looking at Solomon and Uzziah, I'd encourage you guys to make your choices with what you know. And those choices always come with the fact that we, all of us in our condition, that sin nature, that has to be solved. And if you're not a Christian in here, you're listening to all this, you're hearing all the biology, and you're going like, wow, what is it? Where are we going with this? You know, the reality is that Jesus desperately loves you and wants to use you while you exist on this planet, to bring glory to his name. And any way in which you do that, and that's why when I present science, I present it as a way an artist would hand you a set of paints and say, here, go for it. Take the brush out. You can do this too. It is not separated from you. It's a fascinating field, something that should not be avoided, something that you should be dived into with the creative nature that you guys have. Always asking, though, the mechanism, what is its purpose? And where are we going with this? Are we trying to treat people better like Uzziah? Or are we going to transgress and use it for evil like he ultimately did, going into the temple and, doing the whole thing? And the idea is that God's looking at your heart in all that you do. God bless you guys. Have a great rest of the day in Jesus.